Hello everyone, I'm Nökkvi from Birds of Play, and in this video we're going to be taking an in-depth look at the character of Yuna from Final Fantasy X. Since this is, at least on paper, an in-depth look at her character, please do expect some spoilers. However, you can rest easy even if you haven't played Final Fantasy X-2 yet, since this analysis will only focus on Yuna as she is depicted in the original Final Fantasy X, leaving her pop star shenanigans for a later date. If you end up liking the video, please consider subscribing to the channel if you haven't already, and if you're really feeling it today, you could even click that bell to get notified every time we drop a fresh Final Fantasy video. But now without further ado, let's summon the courage to see this analysis through. As a prominent female Final Fantasy character, it's easy to draw parallels between Yuna and characters such as Ash from Final Fantasy XII and Lightning from Final Fantasy XIII. These parallels are then even further strengthened by the fact that all of these characters are in some way tasked with overthrowing the status quo of their respective societies. Furthermore, if we look back to older entries in the Final Fantasy series, we can just as easily notice a trend of female characters that, similarly to Yuna, have the weight of the world on their shoulders, such as Garnet or Dagger from Final Fantasy IX, the Sorceress from Final Fantasy VIII, Aerith from Final Fantasy VII, and Terra from Final Fantasy VI, their sacrifice for the greater good, sometimes being considered par for the course. In a comparable but much more direct way, Yuna's pilgrimage in Final Fantasy X also sets her up as the sacrificial maiden, and even though she isn't the first character to subvert the expectations associated with such a character type, her story does it the most justice, in large part because of how it lies at the heart of the story of the game itself. With that being said, there is quite a widespread notion at this point that Yuna is in fact the main protagonist of Final Fantasy X, as opposed to Tidus. This is in part because of Yuna's importance to the story, and partly due to her strength of character, but I believe that referring to her as the main protagonist does a disservice both to the concept of a main protagonist as an analytical tool, and to Yuna herself as a character. Firstly, the idea that Yuna is the main protagonist due to her importance to the pilgrimage implies that only people of importance can be main protagonists. As is well known, an early draft of the story featured Tidus as a plumber instead of a star athlete, but even if that had been the case, Tidus would still have been the main protagonist as long as the story continued to be filtered through his character. In this regard, point of view therefore trumps general importance, because be they plumber or princess, everyone has a story to tell. This just happens to be his. There is nevertheless something to be said about how Yuna remains central to the plot for a larger portion of the game than previous heroines in the series, with her having ample screen time, playing a pivotal role in most of the game's most memorable moments, and only really taking a back seat in the final moments as Tidus' personal history with Sin is brought to the forefront and leveraged in the game's climax. Like I mentioned earlier, another reason, albeit a lesser one, that some people tend to think of Yuna as the main protagonist is her strength of character, in the sense that she isn't just window dressing for Tidus, and because she isn't the typical damsel in distress. But for a female character to have an independent existence from the main character doesn't necessarily mean that she is the main protagonist in her own right. It just means that she is a well-rounded character, or something to that effect. In all honesty, I think a part of proclaiming Yuna as the main protagonist of Final Fantasy X is probably also just wishful thinking to some degree, at least in some cases, as people scour the archives for a true female lead prior to the debut of Lightning from Final Fantasy XIII. But Yuna can be everything she is without having to be validated by a leading role, just like she can be everything she is without having the approval of the Yevon clergy. And what is Yuna? Well, Yuna is a young girl who walks a tight line, choosing to dedicate her life to making the world a better place for others by ridding it of sin, even as the people closest to her try to discourage her, knowing just like her that it will lead to her untimely death. A bit on the timid side, Yuna is the host of a quiet yet deep resolve, masked by a smile to put those around her at ease. But she isn't afraid to make herself heard when needed, since her moral compass is larger than the doctrines of her faith. It's just a shame that the Final Fantasy X and X-2 remaster failed to capture the real emotion in her face, as he defied both the Church of Yevon and Lady Yuna. It really is a testament to the power of her character that her facial expressions in the original are still imprinted in my mind after all these years. But Yuna isn't just a powerhouse, since she also has a fragile side that makes her courage all the more commendable. And she isn't without fault, since she has a tendency to try to shoulder too much by herself, only to find out that she can't do everything on her own, making her more relatable than the saint she just as easily could have been made out to be. In conclusion, Yuna has all the bearings of a fantastic main protagonist, but she just isn't the main protagonist, and in my opinion, she's none the worse for it. And who knows, maybe someday she will get her own game. Thanks so much for watching. If you liked the video, please consider subscribing to the channel or telling your friends about it. Do you have any Final Fantasy friends? Are we your Final Fantasy friends? We could be your Final Fantasy friends. If you want some Final Fantasy friends, subscribe to the channel. See you next time. Bird sounds. Cuckoo!